Grow, Sell, and Retire is the podcast for the lazy overachiever. B.D. Dalton, author of True Gravity and Grow, Sell, and Retire, is here to give you his 25 years of secrets, tips, and systems to take your business to the next level. This is your chance to find out what is working in sales, marketing, and running your business. If you stop learning, you stop burning. Now, here's your host, BD, with today's GSR podcast.
Hey everybody, BD Dalton here with the Grow, Sell, and Retire podcast, bringing you another great interview with Professor John Mullins. And he's written a couple books, but this is where people really need to start listening, because he is talking about making sure that you can build a business where the customers fund it so you don't need to actually go out and borrow any money to find any venture capital, to move yourself through any of those things that cost you money, give you headaches, move things forward. So he has written multiple books. The next one is looking at New Business Road Test, which is making sure that if you've got a great idea, do you have the right clients for it? Is it the right product? Is it the right this? So how are you going to be able to test that out before you go out and spend lots of money on it? You need to take notes today, because there are multiple ways that you can go out and test for around clients. Make sure that you can fund your business, find more clients, figure out whether there is enough money in what you're doing to make you that lazy overachiever, that successful entrepreneur, and the person that builds wealth beyond what you've ever imagined by listening to people that have been there, done that, bought the t-shirt, and then written about it so that you had access to it. The books are The Customer Funded Business and The New Business Road Test. This is my interview with Professor John Mullins. I am here with John Mullins. He's written some amazing books, especially for people that want to be lazy overachievers. And the most recent one is The Customer Funded Business. John, how did you come up with this idea?
Well, actually, BD, it grew out of my second book, Getting to Plan B, that I wrote with Randy Commissar. In that book, we were studying business models. He and I had both been fascinated by business models, which was a phrase that was in the air everywhere back, a few years after the turn of the millennium. And we were studying companies and trying to understand how entrepreneurs could better think about their business models and how to come up with a business model that would really work. And as part of that research, we studied Costco, and we were just amazed by the fantastic Costco story and the insight that Costco had that said, gee, we could get people to pay us to shop in our store. Imagine that idea. Radical. So after we wrote that book and I had studied Costco, I said, I wonder if there are any other ways that companies, that entrepreneurs are getting people to fund their businesses with revenue instead of, going out and raising investment capital. And so with a research team, I set out to, explore that idea. And the result is we found 5 ways that entrepreneurs use. They've been using them, for many, many years. But these 5 ways don't get talked about, and they're 5 ways that entrepreneurs can get customers to fund their startups.
That's awesome.
So that led to the book.
And we'll come back to those 5 because those are very, very important in the overall thing. And then the other, in between those, you came up with the New Business Road Test too, didn't you? So you had trying to figure out how you were bringing everything together and making sure that you had the right ideas, which is another drastic failure that people have, or they assume that everybody wants something the way that they think that they're going to deliver it.
Well, entrepreneurs are inherently optimistic folks. I was when I was an entrepreneur. It kind of goes with the breed. So when you come up with an idea, you imagine that everybody loves it just as much as you do. But we know empirically that the failure statistics are pretty daunting for entrepreneurial ventures. Most of them fail, sometimes sooner, sometimes later. So there needed to be a way that one could take a disciplined, systematic look at your idea and say, well, is this really likely to work? Or have I found some fatal flaws here that tell me I ought to dump this one and find a better opportunity. And that actually was my first book. I wrote the first edition of it in 2003, but I've updated it several times since then, most recently in 2017.
Very cool. So you going back to that, and is it a great time to be an entrepreneur, and why?
Well, you know what? I think it's always a great time to be an entrepreneur. It's the job of an entrepreneur is to solve problems that exist in our daily lives, or to provide what I call customer delight, to make some mundane experience that we're just kind of going through life without thinking about it, and make that mundane experience into something fantastic. That's kind of what Howard Schultz and Starbucks did. There wasn't, you couldn't say that Americans had a problem to finding a cup of coffee. There are plenty of places to find a cup of coffee for 50 cents back 35 years ago. But what Schultz figured out is if you could make that into a really super experience and sell the experience, not just the coffee, instead of 50 cents, it'd be $3, $4, or $5 for that cup of coffee. And of course, he turned out to be right. So those are the two things that good entrepreneurs do. They either provide customer delight, like Starbucks in its early days, or they solve a problem. And, there's no shortage of problems everywhere in the world, just little things that aren't quite right that could be made better. And it's the job of the entrepreneur to identify those things and go solve it. And so there's no time, problems don't go away or disappear for periods of time. And there's always an opportunity to make something that's just okay quite a bit better.
That's really cool. And so what characteristics do you find that create success in startups and entrepreneurs and the way that they go about doing their normal things that actually become successes?
Well, I think the biggest thing for entrepreneurs is to really focus on and understand their customer well. Peter Drucker was the foremost management thinker of the 20th century. And Drucker said something that was pretty simple but pretty profound. He said, if you don't have a customer, you don't have a business either. So Drucker's advice was, figure out who your customer is, who's got this problem you're going to solve, and then make sure that your solution is something that customer is willing to buy and pay for. And of course, the best test of that is that somebody does that. They write you a check or give you a purchase order. And so I think that's the key thing that startups need to focus on, which is, their customer.
And if that customer base has enough money to turn it into a business and something that could support somebody, or, a business owner and their family and everybody else. So,
well, yes and no. Yes, of course, ultimately you want to get there, but sometimes the initial target market is actually quite small. And once you achieve some traction in that initial market, then you can figure out how to grow from there. And a great example is what Phil Knight and Bill Bowerman did at Nike all those years ago. They were both, Bowerman was a track coach. He was Phil Knight's track coach. And Knight had been a star runner at the University of Oregon on Bowerman's team, and then was in an MBA program at Stanford. And the two of them had observed that distance runners didn't really have the right shoes. The track shoes in those days were mostly made by Adidas in Germany, and they were pretty much made for sprinters. And what sprinters do when they train is run around the track, or they run in straight lines. But that's not what distance runners do. Distance runners run miles and miles and miles, typically on country roads or paths where there are sticks and roots and stones and stuff. And Bowerman and Knight said, well, we need different shoes. We need shoes with more lateral stability because of all these things we're always stepping on. There are a lot of sprained ankles. And we need more cushioning in our shoe because of all the miles we run. So, distance runners would tend to get shin splints from just running so far. So they said, what if we could create a shoe that would solve distance runners' problems? And let's set as our target market elite distance runners. That is, people who could run a 4-minute mile or nearly a 4-minute mile. Well, how big is that target market, BD? 4-minute milers?
Very, very small.
Not too big, right?
Since Bannister's time, it's come up a bit, but not that much.
Yeah, it's a tiny target market. So they spent 5 years peddling their new shoes out of the back of Phil Knight's car at track meets, college track meets up and down the West Coast in the USA, and getting elite runners to try these shoes. And the runners found that A, they trained better, B, they had fewer injuries, and C, because the shoes were very lightweight, they ended up with faster race times. So once these elite distance runners were winning races wearing Nike shoes, then the business began to take off. And then, of course, then you can say, okay, well, now we've built a little platform in this target market. Now, who's our next target market? Well, it's not just elite runners, it's recreational runners too. And of course, they did that. And once they dominated that target market, then they said, well, gee, is there another sport, where we could build better footwear that better meets the needs of the athlete? And they went to tennis, and they went to basketball with Michael Jordan, and so on. So yes, ultimately you need a large enough target market to build a business of whatever size you'd like to build. But many entrepreneurs just want to build a lifestyle business. There's nothing wrong with doing that in a small target market that can fly under the radar. And there's nothing wrong with doing what Knight and Bowerman did, starting with a small target market and then saying, well, okay, how can we use that as a platform into other larger markets thereafter?
Okay, so the one platform there, and finding a small target market, and then moving up from there and moving on. So you talked about 5 different models. So could we start walking through each of those little models? And I know you had some examples of each of them. So it's kind of getting people to that thought process.
Yeah. So the basic idea is that you'd like to get your customer to pay you for whatever it is that you're selling, and to pay you in advance in such a way that you have your customer's money perhaps before you've even built the product, but certainly before you've paid your suppliers. And if you can do that, and there are 5 ways here to do it, then you're always going to have some cash around because you haven't paid your supplier yet, and you can use that float to grow the business. So the first of those models is what I call matchmaker models. It's companies like eBay and Airbnb and Uber and so on that just bring together buyers and sellers. And the company itself, let's take Uber, doesn't own any cars, right? It doesn't need to own cars. It just connects drivers with people who need rides. Airbnb doesn't own any hospitality settings. eBay didn't own any of the goods. It never touched the goods that was sold from your garage to my garage. So it's a pretty simple idea, but if you can find a set of buyers and a set of sellers who actually need each other, where there's a compelling problem on both sides there because it's a two-sided market. If you could find that, they'll pay you to do those transactions. They'll pay you some, percentage of the fee or a listing fee or whatever it is, and then off you go. And with that money, you grow the business.
Cool. So there's matchmaker, Uber, Airbnb, eBay. What's number 2?
So number 2 is probably the most straightforward of the 5 model, and it's what I call pay in advance, and it's what Michael Dell did. So Michael Dell was a 19-year-old freshman at the University of Texas, and the PC world was dawning. And he said, small businesses probably could use PCs, but they have no idea what they need and how to buy one. And when you went into a computer store that you'd find back in those days, it was all geeks talking in a language that no small business person could understand. So Dell said, I'm going to do something really simple here. I'm going to communicate effectively with my small business customer, and I'm going to say, I'll give you exactly the PC you want. You got to pay me for it now, and I'll have it ready for you in 2 weeks. Well, what he did once he got paid was buy the parts for the computer. He'd assemble the computer and then deliver it. And of course, once he got going, he got good terms from his suppliers. so that, he was getting the customer's payment today, but he didn't have to pay the suppliers for those parts until well after he'd bought the parts. And that money, that float, if you will, is what funded the growth of Dell, what we call Dell Technologies today. And interestingly, at a pretty similar point in time, Steve Jobs was a little earlier, but Jobs had done something quite different. Jobs had this vision that PCs could be useful. He wasn't sure at the beginning exactly what they'd be useful for. And he convinced a venture capital investor in California to fund him. Well, Jobs had to give up a pretty significant stake of the business to do that, right? Because pretty risky idea back in those days.
Yeah.
And, the Apple II did pretty well, so they wanted to raise some more money and grow the business and so on. So Jobs funded Apple with round after round after round of venture capital. Dell funded his business with the customer's capital. Question for you, who do you think kept more of the value he created, Steve Jobs or Michael Dell?
Original share capital?
Right? Now, we'd all like to be Steve Jobs, too. But, Steve Jobs got fired along the way. Who's in charge of Dell today? It's still Michael Dell.
Yeah.
So, pay in advance is a fantastic way to do it. And people sometimes ask me, well, why would my customer pay me in advance for something I haven't yet built? Well, they did it for 19-year-old Michael Dell. So if you're solving a compelling problem that the customer has, then they'll pay you for it. And of course, if they won't pay you for what you ask them to pay for in advance, maybe that's really good information to have today, because maybe what that means is you're not actually solving a very compelling problem at all, and maybe you need to rethink things. So that's the second model. Straightforward, get your customer to pay you before you pay your suppliers.
That's awesome. Okay, so number 3, after pay in advance, what comes third?
So the third one is what I call subscription models. Subscription models, we know what all those things are. You subscribe to something, right? It might be Netflix, it might be the Wall Street Journal, it might be a magazine, it might be a box of groceries from the deli that get delivered, organic veggies that get delivered to your doorstep once a week. And again, when do we pay for these subscriptions? Well, we pay something at least up front, right? And then whatever we subscribe for gets delivered over time. So again, you're getting the customer's money up front, and then somewhat later, you pay your supplier. You use that cash you have to grow the business further. Pretty nice.
Yeah, makes it easy, and you can expand yourself and sell them other stuff. Okay, how about number 4?
So number 4 is tricky, perhaps the hardest to put into place, but a retailer that everybody around the world knows called Zara has done it superbly well. It's what I call scarcity-based models. And essentially what Zara has done is the opposite of what Gap, where I used to work, or H&M or other big casual and fashion apparel retailers do. Zara says, we're not trying to sell the maximum amount of every style that we possibly can. Instead, we're going to make each style scarce. So we're only going to make a modest amount of any style. We're going to put it in the stores, and it won't be in the stores very long. And when it's gone, and there won't be any more. So what Zara has been able to do is train its fashionista customers so that when they see something in a Zara store that they like, they buy it today because they know if they come back in a week, it's going to be gone. And of course, that fits many customers' desires anyway, because no two women want to be seen in the same garment. Well, if Zara hasn't made very many of them, the chances of that are pretty low. So what Zara is able to do is watch, let's say, the Spice Girls perform on stage in Liverpool, and within 2 weeks, sometimes they'll have a knockoff of what the Spice Girls wore on stage in the stores for their customers to buy. But again, in limited quantity for a limited time, customers buy it, pay with cash or a credit card, and Zara then pays its supplier 60 days later. So by managing a really tight supply chain and having its own design capability, Zara can go from drawing board to store in a very short period of time, turn that inventory really fast, 12 times a year instead of 4 times at Gap. And that scarcity is what drives the customer to buy. Now, I say scarcity is a hard one because it's been difficult to apply in some settings. And one of those settings is what we now know as the flash sales business.
Yes.
So back in 2001, there was a group of entrepreneurs in France who had been in the business of selling closeout fashion apparel in Paris by taking the unwanted surplus goods off the hands of the fashion apparel makers in France. So fashion apparel makers, like anybody else, don't always get it right, and they make too much of some things, or some styles don't really appeal to the customer. So these guys would take it off their hands, and they'd run these underground sales, sort of member-only sales that would appeal to the kind of customer that wants to get deals, like that. Well, the internet came along and they said, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this online? Because then we wouldn't just be able to reach Paris, we could reach all of France. So they started running 3-day sales. They called them events, and they get a style from a manufacturer. They'd find a fashion model to wear it. They'd shoot a video, and those clothes on that model, even though they were the styles that customers didn't seem to want, in that video on that model, they looked really good. And so customers would buy them. And again, the customers would pay, with a credit card at the end of the 3-day sale. That's all there is, buy it now within 3 days. When the sale's over, it's over. And that's it. And Vente Privée, the name of the company, Vente Privée would then sum up how many units it had sold, tell the vendor would ship, the customer would get their goods, and the vendor would get paid about 60 days later. What would they do with that cash, Vente Privée? Well, they'd use that cash to run some more events. The business grew really nicely. And in 2004 or 5, they ran their first sale of lingerie, and that got enormous press all over Paris, and the business took off. Well, when the global financial crisis hit around 2008, you can imagine there were lots of apparel makers who had made too much of their stuff, right? Because in the financial crisis, people were spending less, so everybody had excess inventory. So what happened is everybody started copying Vente Privée, and there were lookalike knockoffs all over the world. With anybody could build a website and get access to his cousin or his uncle who made fashion apparel was starting one of these sites. Well, it worked fine for a little while, but as soon as the crisis was over and inventories kind of got back in line, there wasn't all that extra unwanted apparel around. But there were all these new companies that had been created to sell it, of course. So the vendors, the manufacturers of this stuff, were pretty smart. They said, well, if they're beating down my doors for these closeouts, well, what should I do? Well, they did 2 things. Number 1, they raised the prices. So the value kind of went away. And number 2, they said, well, yeah, we can make more of that stuff. I could get that fabric again or whatever. So the value for the customer, kind of disappeared.
So the scarcity went away. Is it because they oversupplied?
Well, the value wasn't there. They were still running sales that were just 3 days long, so the scarcity was there, but it really wasn't a good deal anymore because it wasn't any better deal than you could find in the back of the, apparel store in your mall, because the manufacturers were just making this stuff to order for this now new line of business, right? And they'd cheapen the fabric, or they'd take a few stitches per inch out of the construction, and the customers figured it out. So most of the flash sales guys have really struggled, and so too has Vente Privée. They're a big brand in Paris even today, in France, But everywhere else they opened, they've really struggled. And in fact, they had to withdraw from the U.S. after they opened here in partnership with American Express because it just wasn't working. So, flash sales are an interesting idea, but the vast majority of the flash sale merchants, even though the cash characteristics are attractive, the business just hasn't worked in the long run.
Okay, so we've gone matchmaker, we've gone pay in advance, we've got subscription, we've gone scarcity. What's the fifth model?
So the fifth model is what I call service to product models. And for your listeners, BD, that are in service businesses, they know that most of the time in a service business, the customer is paying something in advance already, right? Mm-hmm. So if you want to remodel your kitchen and you hire an architect to do some planning, you're going to pay that architect a part of the fee in order for him to get started. And when you hire a contractor, the contractor may say, okay, I want a third of the money up front. So services are almost always paid for at least partly in advance. So that's a wonderful thing about services businesses. They can be customer funded quite naturally. But the limitation of service businesses is when you try and grow them. Because if it's a service business, let's say you're an ad agency and you get a big new client, well, what you have to do is hire a bunch more people, art directors and artists and copywriters and account execs and so on, to serve that client. So it's very difficult from a people point of view to quickly scale a service business. The cash characteristics are scalable, but the human characteristics make it hard to scale. So the really interesting thing to do is see if you can find in your service portfolio something you can turn into a product that can be sold without all the service handholding. And that's what Microsoft did in its early days. So if maybe not everybody remembers what Microsoft did as a startup, but they were in the business of writing operating systems for the very early PC makers. So these entrepreneurs would start PC companies and they needed an operating system. Well, they'd call Bill Gates and Paul Allen and say, can you write one for us? And they would do that. And they'd write one and then they'd write another one for another PC maker and then another one. And pretty soon, all of these operating systems look pretty much the same, of course, right? Because all the technology was pretty much the same. So they said, well, what if we could just turn this service business into a product business and we could write one operating system, we'll call it MS-DOS, we'll put it in a shrink wrap box, or we'll make it downloadable with a new PC, and we'll see if the company can grow a little faster by selling a product rather than these customized one-off services that we've been doing to date. Well, guess what? That's when the value of Microsoft took off. And of course, thereafter, all the other software, Excel and Word and all the other stuff that Microsoft does today came along, all products, not services anymore. So to the extent that a service business can find something that it can turn into a product that can be sold without all that hand holding, that's a fantastic way to turn a not so scalable service business into a highly scalable product business.
Awesome. So we've got the 5 models. Now, here's some let's move personal questions. So how about who's been your favorite business person that you've interviewed and kind of why? Maybe, and it doesn't have to be somebody that's very well known, but it'd be interesting to hear who you like, because obviously you're famous in throughout the book world and in education and in business. So who's somebody that you've interviewed that you've enjoyed?
Well, there's a really interesting guy from Vancouver, BC in Canada named Rudd Brown, and I tell his story briefly in the customer-funded business. But he started a really cool business in selling refurbished mobile computing devices. And by mobile computing devices, I mean those handheld dudes that a FedEx driver carries or a supermarket clerk uses to reorder next week groceries and so on. These little handheld computers.
Yes.
And in that industry, of course, there are technology cycles. So the miniaturization makes things get smaller and more powerful. And of course, as each generation comes along, there's new software that comes with a new generation. So there's sort of a built-in obsolescence into this category. Well, what Rudd Brown figured out was that sometimes a customer doesn't want to switch to the new model. They actually, have their system set up and standardized around the old model. But of course, the vendors discontinue the old models and the customer can't get any more. So maybe you're a small supermarket chain and you have these devices in all your stores. Well, you open another store, you need some more devices, but the manufacturer doesn't make them anymore. And you don't want to switch all your stores to the new system, because that would be a big investment. So what Rudd Brown figured out is that if he could find the old stuff that was probably sitting around on people's shelves gathering dust, they'd be happy to get rid of it, probably for a song. And then when somebody needed that old stuff, they couldn't get it anywhere else, so they'd be happy to pay a very attractive price to get their hands on it. So Rudd Brown and his business called RiseX became the intermediary in this category that would find all this old stuff where it was sitting around. They'd buy it, and typically buy it on 90-day terms. And then they find customers who want to pay for it, and those customers would be asked to pay either in advance or not later than 7 days. Well, he built that idea into a $75 million business.
Wow.
Pretty cool.
That's very, very cool. Yeah, keeping stuff on file. So here's what are you reading right now for fun and for kind of studies or kind of looking at other books or things that you're working on?
Well, one of the cool things I do is I watch Steve Blank and I read everything he writes. He's one of the most important thought leaders, in my judgment, in the entrepreneurial world. We all talk about lean startup. Steve is the godfather of the lean startup movement. He kind of created it, conceptualized it, and it's become a really important set of tools that every entrepreneur needs in his toolkit. So I read Steve Blank religiously. I follow his blog. He's a great guy.
Very cool. Very cool. And then and what bit of tech or software or something else that's kind of making your life easier or helping you unplug?
Well, I've interestingly recently discovered Zoom, and I know it's the platform that you use as well, BD. But I'm doing quite a lot of work on online education to take these sets of ideas that I've generated and help them have impact to a wider community than is ever likely to set foot on the London Business School campus. So, we have people all over the world that want to be entrepreneurs and can benefit from getting their customers to fund their businesses. And so I'm now using Zoom to prepare videos that I do sitting at my desk, to do webinars. There's one currently running with Emeritus called Startup Success that explores these 5 models and how to put them to use in your business. I'm finding Zoom to be really cool technology that's helping me in very tangible ways.
Makes it very easy to connect with people and distribute thoughts, I think.
Yep.
So it's very cool. Okay, and so how do people find out more about you, about the books, things like that? What's the website?
Well, I'm on Twitter. Each of the books has a website of its own: The Customer Funded Business, The New Business Road Test, Getting to Plan B. I'm on LinkedIn. It's interesting. Every time another cohort of my course ends online, I get a whole bunch of new LinkedIn followers. So I know I know that people are enjoying getting their hands on these ideas and thinking about how to put them to work.
I think that anybody that wants to start a business that's not finding funding is so difficult right now, and especially when people don't completely understand where you're coming from and the type of money that you typically need. So the 5 models, I know you said scarcity is very difficult, but any of the other models are implementable. Yep. and make their life so much easier.
Yep, exactly.
So if somebody was walking out of here and they only listened to the last minute, what's your top tip to entrepreneurs?
I think my top tip is, if you don't have a customer, you don't have a business. So figure out how to get a customer, find a problem you can solve, and get somebody to write you a check or give you a purchase order to pay for your solution. Now, it's sort of interesting. Twitter has been trying to prove that wrong for a long time, right? So we don't have to pay to tweet on Twitter. Donald Trump doesn't pay to tweet. So aside from a very small amount of advertising revenue they get, Twitter essentially doesn't have paying customers. They have users, but they don't have many customers. So they're trying to prove this maxim wrong. But most of the time, if you don't have a customer, you don't have a business either. So find a way to get a customer and get that customer to pay you up front.
So test it out to see if your thoughts are going to work. Well,
yep.
Well, John, thank you so much for your time today, and we really appreciate it. And we'll make sure that we put this in the show notes and make sure that people can track you down, find the books, and hopefully on there they can figure out either how to have you come speak or where you're speaking also.
Sure. That'd be great.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, John. And
thank you, PD.
Hopefully we can help more people grow, sell, and retire.
Thanks for joining us on Grow, Sell, and Retire. For more information, tools, or to book one of our team members to work with your team, business, or to speak at your event or conference, visit bartdaltonconsulting.com or email contact@bartdaltonconsulting.com. Buy the book True Gravity on Amazon. If you want to work for the rest of your life, that is your business. If you don't, that is ours.